So, welcome everybody here in the room, outside on the stream, and those in the future who'll check out the stream later. I'm so pleased to have Linda Weintraub here visit us. She's here for the CAA conference, and there's actually a lot of people coming in from all over. So we had a kind of a nice opportunity to bring her in a day earlier to give a talk. Linda Weintraub is an artist, curator, educator, and she really lives what she preaches. She's passionate about the environment, ethics, artists being activists and really influencing our environment. She's supportive of other artists. She's very interested in expanding the idea of education and the arts, not having it separate. As an educator, she's someone who's very much into experiential education and getting people involved in the process. And when we work together, I always felt like I was constantly challenged by Linda to think deeper into the work that I was presenting to her. One of the ways that recently she's been living what she's preaching is by starting a collection of books. She's got a trilogy now that's called Avant-Guardians, Texlets in Ecology and Art. This is an ongoing project, and it's publishing by demand. And I was just so impressed to see Linda a couple of years ago at CAA with all these big publishers, and she stood there with her own setup and publishing on demand and explaining the whole philosophy of how we don't really need to have all this paper out with all these books, and whoever needs the books can order them. They're all black and white and on recycled material. And I just love to see someone who actually acts in coordination with what they're saying. She's really well known for a number of books she's authored, and it's the kind of a personification of an artist author. One of her, she's also, I should say, and I have to say this, her homestead in upstate New York is mind-boggling. It really, truly is. I mean, she's practically off the grid and self-sustaining, and it is an artwork in itself. So it's all-encompassing. When it comes to ecology and the environment, she lives it, she breathes it, and she, I don't know, I just could go on and on. So we'll just let her tell you about her ideas about beauty and activism and art. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Victoria. Victoria and I have gone swimming together in the little ponds near where I live, and she is such a good partner in terms of having fun, and we have had a lot of fun together. The one thing that Victoria hasn't mentioned about my little bio is that I just love exploring new subject matter. The minute I start feeling like a bit of an expert at something, I move on to something else that I know nothing about. So this is one of those lectures where it's a work in progress. I'm really eager to get your feedback. I'm going to try out some ideas on you. These kinds of situations are very helpful to me because I do a lot of writing, and so I can begin to experiment with some ideas, and I welcome your comments. Don't wait till the end of the talk. I mean, it's a nice intimate group here, and I would really welcome your comments anytime you have any to offer. So I prepared a talk called Drop Dead Gorgeous, and I had a kind of systematic way of presenting this material, and I left home with my little PowerPoint and all the notes, and I realized I didn't have nice introduction. So in the airport yesterday, I'm contemplating what shall I do for the introduction to this talk. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm in the airport waiting to get for our flight to get announced, and I take a look at this man. This is God's honest truth. Sounds unlikely. I didn't make it up. And he's a little portly, he's a middle-aged man, and he's wearing a black t-shirt, and I take a double take when I read the big white letters announcing that he says on his t-shirt, "Stop whining, start a revolution. And I said, hey, I'm giving a talk as part of a series on activism in art. Maybe I could use that key phrase, stop whining, start a revolution, and would that be my introduction? And then I started looking around at the person who was wearing this t-shirt, and I said, oh, it's much more interesting in context than if I was to extract the phrase. Because there was this man, he had a baseball cap on his head with a rim in the front. It was generic. I didn't see any baseball teams announced on it. He was wearing bright white ankle socks with Birkenstock sandals, and he was wearing khaki Bermudas, which meant I had an opportunity to take a look at his calves, and his calves were the most fascinating part of all. They were large and large enough to accommodate a very elaborate tattoo. And I tried so hard to figure out what this tattoo was, and it was a scroll with a wooden pole on top and a wooden pole on the bottom, and in between the two, in multicolored, yellow, orange, blue, green, purple, there seemed to be some Chinese text going vertically. And I began to wonder, what would a man like this start a revolution about? And what would that revolution consist of? And then I looked at this scroll a little harder. This is such a delicate, nuanced tattoo that the fabric of the scroll had actually come loose from the pole and was hanging down. And I'm thinking, oh, is this a sign of a failed revolution, or is he tearing down the opposition and this is triumphant? And what I started thinking about was, God, there are so many kinds of revolutions, so many people who are revolutionary, who have causes that they promote and have manners of promoting them. And I began to think, my goodness, here we are. This is the perfect introduction to my talk, because what I'm going to be presenting is not the classical kind of activism that you might associate with people who are protesting the dissemination of a forest, or pro or con abortion, or any of the other kinds of identifiable values that can incite a revolutionary activist stance. I decided, let's take a step back and talk about the core values that are then manifested in terms of pro or con abortion, or whether stem cell research should be allowed, and issues like that. So the very topic that I'm going to be talking about is our definition of beauty. And there is a kind of a thesis to this talk, and that is that any culture's concept of beauty, whether beauty is defined physically in one way or stands for something in another way, always conforms to the very qualities that a society considers desirable and pleasing and esteemed. Okay? So in terms of my own little history, this is an activist defiant stance. To address beauty would probably be the most radical resistance to all of my training as an artist. When I was in school, the word was banished from our vocabulary. I'm sure all the years I was there, it was never uttered once. In order to acknowledge the fact of beauty, you were identifying yourself with kind of superficial, sentimental, nostalgic visualization of something that had nothing to do with the substance and the core and the seriousness of art in itself. And I distinctly remember the first time I gave any serious consideration to beauty in art. And it happened after I was graduated. And it was a work of art by Sophie Calla, and it was done in 1986, and it was called Blind. And in that work of art, she asked a number of people who had been blind since birth to describe what they thought of when they imagined something beautiful. And let me read you just a couple of their responses. One of them said, I met people who were the most beautiful thing I ever saw is the sea going out so far that you lose sight of it. Sheep are beautiful because they don't move and because they have wool. Or this one, the view from the balcony is beautiful. It produces a first-class aesthetic emotion. That is where I go to clear my mind and contemplate, to watch time pass by. Beauty is harmony. So what Sophie did was she interviewed people who have been blind since birth. She asked them to identify what they considered to be beautiful. She photographed them, so you saw the face of the artist. Then you saw on another canvas the statement that they made, and then Sophie went and photographed the thing that they had imagined. And I was really impressed, and I was impressed because it was conceptually a rich piece of art, and I was impressed also because of the way that beauty is so connected to the visual sense that even blind people seem to first have a response to beauty in terms of having a visual experience. And the other thing about these statements that was so interesting to me is that over and over again it was the, quote, natural world, not the world of human contrivance, that was identified as something which was so beautiful. And as the years have gone by, I've begun to have a deeper respect for the issue of beauty and its role in art. And as I've become more and more involved in ecological systems and the human relationship with the world beyond human interactions, I have begun to pay a lot of attention to beauty because I think it is really at the core of our environmentalist thinking, because after all, beauty defines the relationship between the viewer and the world outside of the viewer. And that seems to me to be the very concept and the core of an ecological consciousness. So beauty is the quality or characteristic of a thing or a person that gives us deep and intense pleasure. It's what we value and value highly, and because we value it, it's what we nurture and what we protect. And in that way, I think it is core to our thinking about environmental considerations. So I began, as the years have gone by, to ruminate about beauty, not in a particularly consistent way, not in an academic way, but I'd have these quirky little thoughts and wonder, you know, how beautiful are sunsets? We all agree probably that sunsets are beautiful, but what about a sunset that is beautiful because of the pollution in the air? Is that beautiful? Or I was thinking about the swirling iridescent forms that float on water after there is an oil spill. Is that beautiful? How connected is beauty with the pure visual sense? And how much does it matter about the function and the meaning and the reason for these visual phenomena to take place? And then I began to think of, well, what parts of nature may not be considered beautiful? And there seems to be a consensus that clear-cut forests and strip mines and landfills and toxic waste dumps may not be considered beautiful, but I don't quite know why. Is it because visually they don't delight us anymore because there's not the variety and the nuance of gorgeous shades, millions colors of green and textures and different light qualities? Or is it because we are upset by the meaning behind these components of our landscapes, that they are unhealthy, that the systems that had functioned there before human interference have become disrupted? And then I started thinking, well, what things in nature are normally considered beautiful and which ones aren't? And so petals and icicles are always gorgeous and people love flowers of every form, but there are other parts of nature that may not be qualified as beautiful, like dung and maggots and carrion beetles and vultures and a rotting corpse, rust, mold. These are parts of nature as well, and yet they seem to be eliminated from most people's consensus about what is beautiful in nature. And then again, I wonder, is it because they're not pretty to look at, or is it because they're associated with processes that tend to carry a repulsive response within our culture? But what is coming through with all of these ruminations is that beauty is really not merely a visual phenomena, but invested in beauty are cultural values. And so when I start thinking about these cultural values and I think of beauty, I start thinking about what carries do we associate with beauty? What kind of situations are beauty that go beyond just visual appearance? And I start thinking about, a sports event, and then we say that home run was a beauty, or it was a beautiful putt, because we thought it was performed so well, and we admire that. Or the surgery went beautifully. Or someone would say about generosity, wasn't that a beautiful gesture? So what I'd like to do with this lecture is kind of expand our conception of beauty beyond just purely a visual sense. And I've got 5 quick propositions to offer you. All right, proposition number 1 is that beauty is an indicator of a culture's core values. Proposition number 2 is that beauty seems to have a special relationship with the world of nature, the non-human world, even though obviously it's not exclusive to that. Proposition 3, parts of nature that society considers to be beautiful are the parts that we also think of as having value, that we assign stature to it. We think of them as virtuous and worthy. Proposition 4 is that we tend to care for the things we consider beautiful. And proposition 5 is that we often neglect the things or even abuse them if we don't consider them beautiful. So that leads to a question for us all to ponder today, and that is it possible, given evidence of exploitation and deteriorating ecosystems, that the reason for that can partially be assigned to the fact that our prevailing definition of beauty allows for this kind of abuse to take place? So I began to think, what does beauty look like when it reflects ecosystems that are vital and resilient and productive? And what would artworks need to represent if we were to make art with the thought of preventing further kinds of environmental crises that we've been seeing? And how many ways can beauty be presented so that it doesn't any longer seem like a frivolous, superficial, sensual, momentary experience, but something which is really quite profound and revealing of a whole set of cultural values? So in order to do this, I'm going to start with 2 artists. You might consider them total cliches in the art world. They are totally well known to probably all of you, and I'm going to be showing works of art which are very popular and well known, but I'm choosing them because I think they lay the groundwork for this dialogue about beauty that permits for abuse to take place and environmental neglect, and the kind of beauty that may nurture our sentiments and our functional relationship with the environment so that it is protected and remains vital. One of them is acclaimed for making the most drop-dead gorgeous works of art, provides visual pleasure. He is beloved by the vast majority of people, where they're mostly, I guess, if they are not sophisticated art world professionals. The other one is equally intense in terms of evoking public response, but it is the opposite response. He attracts contempt and derision, and the response you often get to his work is shock and disgust. And they're both, in a way, addressing issues of beauty. One of them is the poster child of the ecological world, and that's Andy Goldsworthy. And the other I like to call the enfant terrible, as opposed to the poster child, and that's Damien Hirst. And so what I'd like to do is take just a couple of minutes before I start showing you more current work that addresses issues of beauty to lay out the groundwork between 2 artists who are addressing beauty in completely opposite ways, one of them conforming to prevailing norms in our culture and the other one defying those norms. So let us see Andy Goldsworthy have musical background? Can we just leave that go?
What's playing here? It must be. Let's close. Oh, let's see if iTunes is. Okay, just so it doesn't pop up again for you. Here you go.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No. Okay, so here's Andy Goldsworthy. Andy Goldsworthy, just to remind us all of the core characteristics of his works of art, goes out to the streams and hillsides and shorelines and forests in order to make his art. He is not working in the studio. His medium is found on site, so he works with twigs and ice and petals and snow, any material that is already there. His tools, he goes with nothing but his own hands and his own cleverness, and so even his tools are scavenged on site, and so he will use thorns and reeds and maybe his own spit in order to adhere the items that he selects from the environment into the configurations that he chooses. So here we have him totally site-specific, bringing in no industrial machinery and really merely rearranging the items that he finds in the site already. And yet we have to ask, is this work ecological? I mean, one thing goes without saying, it is totally dignified as being beautiful. Here is one quote out of a zillion. I actually, as a hobby, have made a collection of quotes about Andy Goldsworthy that utilize the word beauty. Here are just two. Using nature as his canvas, the artist creates works of transcendent beauty. Another one, his works whisper to us of wind streaming off mountains, offshoots and branches, the transience of beauty in nature. Okay, so the consensus is that what Andy Goldsworthy presents to us is beautiful. So he's here to tell us what we think is beautiful in our culture. So in the first case, we saw leaves that were rearranged and reconfigured into a totally neat and orderly configuration. In this one, these are rowan leaves from the tree. We get a very tidy progression from yellow to orange and red to maroon. We absolutely see that humans have intervened, and what Andy Goldsworthy is presenting to us is a image of absolute clarity and precision. This is an ice spiral that he made by adhering icicles that he found on site. He melted the two ends and reconnected them so that the spiral circles the tree. It is a, quote, gorgeous image, but it is a kind of image that could never have existed without human intervention. And this one is another example of Andy Goldsworthy utilizing the area that he works in as his studio, utilizing the materials from that area as his medium, utilizing whatever he finds on site as his tools, and still contriving exclusively the forms. So the forms are not derived from the image. They stand in absolute opposition to the environment in which they are found. So the stack of stones is all white stones. They are arranged in ascending order of size. They are precariously balanced. This could never have been found without human intervention. I have a feeling Andy waited and waited for the last disturbance behind the hollow in the rocks so that there was a clear background for the stones. So what could he do? He could make the perfect photograph, the perfectly controlled image that was contrived by a human being. He loves to separate out what is human-made from what is not human-made, and there is always a very clear distinction between the two. We can imagine that seconds after he snaps the shutter and creates this image, A wind probably came along. It would have dispersed the leaves in the first few images. It probably would have melted the ice in the ice work of art, and I'm sure these stones would come tumbling down. But he wants this perfect instant of clarity, precision, and order. In other words, what people consider beautiful is an image that demonstrates human control. We seem to like it when works of art perform acrobatic feats of balance. And we seem to like it when, instead of the multiplicity of the environment that hasn't been tampered with, an artist can impose simplicity. And we seem to prefer clarity to complexity. We seem to like pure geometries and simple shapes more than irregularities. We seem to like it when an object is separated from its context. It's different from its background. We seem to be very happy when our role as viewer is merely to observe and not to participate. And it seems to suggest that the world of nature is there to delight us humans rather than to function on its own. So you have to think, why is Andy Goldsworthy's work so popular? Is it popular because it conforms to, say, a city dweller's experience of the non-human world, which is garnered mostly through photography and film and packaging and calendars and billboards and travel brochures and the like, that we actually are more comfortable with the non-human realm when it is flat, controlled, everything is lit beautifully, and it is a simple image rather than having to confront the tumultuous complexity of the world that's not controlled by humans. Is this an insult to suggest that Andy Goldsworthy is imposing his human will on the natural environment? I think not, because he says himself, quote, "My art is unmistakably the work of a person. I would not want it otherwise. It celebrates my human nature and a need to be physically and spiritually bound to the earth." Well, he may be bound to the earth while he's making these works of art, but the people who consider them beautiful are not. They are separated from it, and they are admiring the two-dimensional, static image that he has created. Okay, are you ready to switch gears? Let's talk about Damien Hirst and a work of art called 1,000 Years. It was done in 1990. It was a sensation. You want activist art. If you measure activist art in terms of outrage and headline space, this one would have to stand as an example of the ultimate. Just to describe for those of you who don't know, it is a very large vitrine surrounded in glass with a steel frame. The dimensions are 7 feet by 24 feet by 7 feet. And so you will see that there are 2 portals. There's a cube on one side with openings, and on the other side there is a very controversial subject matter. That subject matter is the rotting remains of a cow head. The piece is intentionally infested with flies and maggots. The eerie blue light that you saw on the previous slide comes from an ultraviolet fly zapper, which is suspended over the cow's head. So when you look at this work of art, you not only see the rotting remains of the cow, but you see it infested with swarms of flies and maggots. They mate and give birth in the cubicle on one side. They feast and they die in the section that's close to you here on the other side. So when viewers looking at this work of art search for beauty because they think art should be beautiful, they tend to feel like everything they had ever loved in art has been lost, that what they have cherished most has been sacrificed. As a matter of fact, one other quote from one of the reviews of this show is this. It says, "For thousands of years, art has been one of our great civilizing forces. Today, it threatens to make barbarians of us all." So what is barbaric about it? What's barbaric is that people look at rotting flesh. They see glass walls that are stained yellow with fly excrement. They see the shriveled corpses of flies that have been zapped. And they are horrified, and this is not considered beautiful. So I want to ask you, what does it mean that decay and decomposing matter is considered ugly, not beautiful? And does this indicate a cultural value that we resist evidence of the full life cycle and prefer only the parts that are vital and pretty? So that I started thinking about, how many ways do we manifest this resistance and suppression of decay? And it's easy to make a really long list. Think of how many ways we do it with wood preservatives, food stabilizers, rust retardants, embalming fluids, fluoride treatment, Botox, stainless steel, and the list goes on and on. And then I started thinking, gosh, there's an indicator of how squeamish we really are about issues of decay. And that comes from the names of heavy metal bands, because after all, they're going to be counterculture to the extreme. And what I thought was so interesting, because I did a little research, what do they call themselves? They bypass death. Death isn't what we're squeamish about. We're squeamish about the rotting material of life. And so here are some names of heavy metal bands. One's called Lust of Decay, Decomposition, Still Life Decay, Putrid Pile, Decay of Salvation, Garden of Decay. I could go on and on. So I think, my gosh, here's Damien Hirst, who's never been given his full credit. He is a heavy metal artist. Okay, so what does Damien Hirst do? Just what the heavy metal artists do. He confronts us with our taboos. He dispenses with any kind of social nicety. He gives us a head-on view of perishable material perishing. And he shows us that death is not an abstract concept. It is really very real. Okay, so what do we then have to start saying? If ecology depends on the full life cycle in order to keep ecosystems healthy, it depends as much upon critters dying and decaying, being dismantled by decomposer organisms such as the carrion beetles and the vultures, so that the organic materials, those molecules that once constituted one form of life, could be reconstituted into another form of life. That what works beautifully in an ecosystem is an ecosystem which has as much decay occurring as life. So, Damien Hirst confronts this thought straight on. I'm about to use a quote with a four-letter word that's often considered impolite, but there is no quote from Damien Hirst that doesn't contain this word, so here we go. He says, "What the fuck are we doing dying? It's so delicious. It's so beautiful. It's so fabulous. You don't have to buy a microscope to see how fabulous it is. The real gear, the stuff that we're living in, rots, and things that rot are so fucking colorful." So where are we going to go from here? You know what's so interesting? I have looked and looked for an image of the cow head really putrid and decayed, and I can't find any. It's as if the people documenting this work of art just could not confront how gross it actually became. It became so offensive in terms of the odor that it gave off that Damien Hirst realized he had to do something. And he said, well, gosh, I made this piece so people look at decay. And if they're going to be turned off because it smells so bad, I won't fulfill the mission of my own work. So he eventually took it back, scraped away the decaying matter, replaced that with ketchup and other things the flies would be happy to eat, and the piece continued in that fashion. Okay, so here we go. All of my questions I now present to you. I'm going to present a number of artists who I think may be perpetuating the Andy Goldsworthy mode of making art. And then I'm going to show you a number of artists who may be presenting a more ecologically integrative way of making art. These are brand new thoughts. I'm not real familiar with these artists. I'm just becoming acquainted with them, and I really hope that you'll comment as you have things you want to share with me. Okay, here's Marta. Marta does the following. She uses as her tools for making her art microsurgical needles that have cauterizing tips on them to do micrografting. And what she micrografts is the butterfly while it's still in the pupa stage and its wings are just beginning to develop. And what Marta does is damage the wings, causing wounds that will then heal. And as the butterfly then continues to mature and live, it carries the pattern of Marta's inscriptions rather than the ones it would have had without her intervention. She talks about creating aesthetic creatures, participating in evolution that at one point is considered random. She calls these creatures novel naturel. And here's a quote. She says, "My work has been focused on the possibilities that modern biology offers artists. DNA, proteins, and cells offer an opportunity to explore novel ways of representation and communication. I created live butterflies with wing patterns never seen before in nature. I achieved this by interfering with normal development mechanisms of the butterflies. The butterflies are simultaneously natural. Their wings are made of normal live cells without artificial pigments, but designed by an artist. To my knowledge, it was the first time live animals, not bacteria or plants, were modified for artistic purposes and exhibited." Question. Here she is tampering with the biological system. She insists that at the stage of development that she interferes, there are no pain sensors, so the butterfly is not, quote, suffering. It goes on, she says, to live a long and normal life, but she is tampering purely for aesthetic reasons. She is isolating the butterfly from its functional part in the ecosystem. And I wonder, I ask you to contemplate, is this kind of action justifiable? Do we sanctify it? Is this considered beautiful or not? Eduardo has done a lot of tampering over time. Here he is with his bunny, who became a transgenic bunny when he cloned a gene that from a jellyfish that had a green fluorescent protein in it, so that under certain lights our bunny glows green. And he has worked this technology with many other animals and plants as well. He insists that his altered animals continue to live as they always might without his intervention. But it is definitely weird to see these animals glowing green. And Eduardo is a really smart and thoughtful man, and he doesn't do this kind of activity without analyzing it, considering its implications. And in this work of art, he has really devoted himself to manifesting the powers that humans now have to tamper in life creation itself. Very poignantly, the title of this piece is Genesis. It's very complicated, and to tell you all of the components of it would take much too long. Suffice it to say that what he did was synthesize a gene, DNA, and he sequenced it so that when you read the sequence in the DNA profile, it read the statement from Genesis that says man, I guess, and woman. Let them have dominion over the fish and the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth. You know the statement very well. Directing his and the viewer's perceptions to perhaps the need to set limits on human dominion or not, raising the question, asking if humans are now engaged in creating life, is this now tampering with God's almighty power to create life? And he's raising a lot of ethical and, I guess, practical questions as well. I think it's significant that the gene that he embedded this new DNA in is his own body gene. He calls it his artist gene, and his work of art is the creation of this brand new gene. Okay, here's Verena. Verena also does tampering in with life. This piece is called I Compare Myself with You. Her medium is planaria. It's a kind of a worm, it's a flatworm that has the ability to regenerate its own body tissue. And by manipulating it, she has made these planaria grow with 2 heads, not 1. And the interesting part about this manipulation is that both of the heads have eye spots, and both of them have little brains, and both of them have a will. And so she talks about watching this single worm battle with itself as one head wants to go in one direction and the other head has to go in the other direction, and the worm will only survive if the 2 heads agree and come to some kind of consensus. So what do we make of this? I'm totally confused by it. I'd like to read a statement by her. She says, I was engaging in the creation of a 2-headed flatworm. I personally began to feel guilt and empathy for the animals that had been at my mercy since I had purchased them from a lab 3 months earlier. I myself was struggling with the direction of the project. It seemed to be going in an unethical way. I felt perhaps like I was unwillingly and tragically creating the second head on one of my own living sculptures that was pulling me along in its own journey. I read this statement, I said, my goodness, all of her misgivings seem to be centered on her own feelings and not on the dilemma that she's presented to this living creature, this planaria worm. Okay, so all of these artists seem to be creating form in the manner that Andy Goldsworthy did. They seem to be extracting it from this form of living matter, from its place in the ecosystem cycles, and creating something for the purpose of asserting human control and dominance and demonstrating human power. But you can work in this bio realm and possibly make very different kinds of statements. So if we're going to start thinking about, well, what lesson or what example does Damien Hirst present for us? What might be an environmental aesthetic? What means not only beautiful, but beautifully, that it functions well? There are probably 2 criteria that I would think we'd need to pay attention to. One is it's got to be productive, okay? And it's got to be sustainable, which means that in order for something, an organism to perform and be beautiful, it's got to fit into a niche. And the niche means not only does it find shelter and food for itself, not only does it reproduce and raise its own young, it is only beautiful if it does this without it performing in this manner at the expense of the ecosystem, but it allows for the ecosystem to survive as well, so that by surviving, by being productive, it is also sustainable in that that component of the ecosystem is sustained as well as all the other components of the ecosystem, the system itself, and ultimately all the systems of the planet as well. So no component of an ecosystem can be viewed in isolation from its role in the larger drama of life on this earth. So it comes to a question of what is beautiful from an ecological sense. Maybe what we need to accept and admire are all the aspects of an ecosystem, see it all if it's a component of a healthy ecosystem. Health means that it maintains its procreative vitality, and that means not only humans, but humans and all the other creatures that we share the planet with. So let's take a look at some artists' work who may fulfill this mandate. This is an art collaborative, an Austrian art collaborative called Gelatin. They have made this huge bunny rabbit. You get a sense of the scale here. Way up in the Austrian Alps, and you would, to hear a description of this piece, imagine a cuddly, sweet, adorable critter, because it's pink and it's a bunny and it's stuffed and it's crafted. As a matter of fact, most of the structure itself was made by villagers who knit this massive quantity of overrun pink wool to cover the whole rabbit with. Yet you look at it and it is ghoulish and macabre. It looks like some offering to some god way up on a mountaintop. And even it has entrails that are already spewing out. So it has begun its decaying death process even before the last stitch was made and the bunny was complete. All right, what is it doing here? Well, it has everything to do with death and decay, and it was designed in order not only to represent them, but to functionally enact those processes. So we have our rabbit sprawled like an offering on the mountaintop, stuffed with intentionally unstable materials. It is stuffed with hay and covered with wool, and the artists were delighted that it started decaying even before the last stitch was made. And why do they want it to delay? Because they want their work of art to feed the fauna and the flora in the alpine area. So let me read a quote from Gelatin. They say, "The rabbit is feeding a lot of other kinds of life. There are already mushrooms and grass growing out of it, and there is lots of this yellow thing appearing. It looks like a doll that vomited. I saw birds nesting. Cows want to lie down on the straw. The straw is radiating warmth as it decays. This is appealing to animals in winter. It is creating niches that protect animals from the wind. It stores moisture between the legs. It makes all these animals feel like home." So it is a ritual offering, and it's a ritual offering to the critters who inhabit this area. The artist realized that a bunny of these dimensions would take a very long time to decompose, that the piece would not be complete until the last little piece of straw decomposed and was absorbed by the ecosystem. So in order to make certain that the piece fulfilled its destiny, they negotiated with the villagers in the nearby town, and all of them have agreed not to remove the sculpture or interfere with its processes for 20 years. So the piece was completed in the year 2005, and it's going to stay that way for another 20 years, no matter what happens. Well, I think this is really interesting, because through this process, the villagers are acknowledging the full cycle of life. They are associating with art and its connection with beauty, a process that has often not been connected to them. The whole idea is to celebrate this and to remove our associations with decay being repulsive. And the artists express this with this quote. They say, "Happily in love." Oh, it's to be walked on, I should say, and people are as welcome as the sheep and the rabbits who live in the area. "Happy in love, you step down the decaying corpse, through the wound, now small like a maggot." You imagine being like a maggot. That's your scale to this rabbit. "Over woolen kidneys and the bowel. Happy you leave like a larva that gets its wings from an innocent carcass on the roadside. Such is the happiness that made this rabbit." How's that? Amazing? Gorge Guesser makes a very direct statement about our cultural values related to beauty. He is a horticulturist. His medium is the iris, and he is really distressed about the fact that through marketing interests, wildflowers are all beginning to look alike because there are certain aesthetic characteristics that people tend to love. They love double blossoms and they love ruffles. And so all different flowers now are taking the form of double blossoms with ruffles. And he has decided, as an activist, one-person campaign, very quietly, to craft the new form of hybridization that he calls rewilding, to undo the commercial marketing value system and to return these biological organisms to a state prior to human interference. Am I making myself understood? You get it? So anyhow, so he controls the fertilization. He is not using anything high-tech. This is like 19th century technology. Mutations take place quite by accident, but whenever he finds a mutation that undoes the direction of the commercial and cultural sense of what a beautiful flower is, he isolates that particular plant and begins to use it to reproduce the next one. He's going back and back until he hopes to return to what wildflowers would have looked like without human interference. He talks about wildflowers being so miraculous, so full of wonder, and so deserving our respect. He says they're unprotected through frozen winters and parched and baking summers on cliffs and cracks of sidewalks and treetops or in desolate wastelands. I'm very much opposed to the hothouse variety flower that seems to be produced now. Grimley is a young artist who is doing really amazing work that demonstrates an ecological sense of not only interaction, but of humans being in service to the non-human world. Jai did this piece in 2006 in which she sent her own urine to a floriculture lab, and the report came back to say that her urine contained all the nutrients that would be beneficial for plant growth, but those nutrients were not in the proper proportion. So Jai did some research and she changed her diet in order to create urine that would be in service to the flowers that she was going to feed with her urine. So she ate lots of spinach and tofu and nuts, and then she would continually collect her urine and taste it, and test it. Ta-da, we're gonna taste it too. She grew Napa cabbages with it hydroponically, and then what she did was serve it to the public. And as a matter of fact, the new piece I just read about that I think is not done yet, she's going to offer this opportunity to art viewers. So it won't be her urine that is being manipulated, but the art viewers will have the opportunity to do this as well. And she's going to be feeding vegetables and flowers. She's going to make kimchi, sauerkraut, teas, and tinctures out of it. And she's going to, of course, have everybody enjoy imbibing plants that were grown with human urine. No comment? What do you think? All right, so is it beautiful? Is it beautiful for a human to have, as in this case, her goal to fit into the ecosystem, to serve the ecosystem, to not think of herself as an isolated entity, and to not think about the world of plants as a resource to feed her, but as an opportunity for her to make an offering to them? Polana opens up yet another part of the human dependence on the non-human world. She did this piece called Private Microcosmos of the Organisms, And what she did for this work is extract from her own body populations of bacteria and fungi. And she cultured these so that the colonies grew to be large enough so that they would be observable to the naked eye. And she placed them in porcelain molds of her own body to bring back the connection that these fungi and these bacteria cohabit in her body with her own cells, and that she is dependent upon them for her health, as we all are, that they originate in the environment outside of the body, that we are continuous with the ecosystem in which we exist, and that our phobia against microbes and dirt and bacteria is really misguided, since life depends on these kinds of symbiotic relationships. And Michael Blasi is an activist artist because he thrusts in our face the beauty of decaying matter in terms of expanding the mediums that he works with in order to create his art. The piece that you're seeing now, which is called, ironically, Atomic Bomb, is made out of 91 kilos of soy noodles that were dyed. This is a piece that's a tower of moldy oranges that were presented in order to attract flies. And this is a piece done in 2007. The material list is very revealing. He made this work with chocolate, bacon, carrots, mashed potatoes, pureed beets, and yogurt. And he presented them in a way so that he welcomed the microorganisms acting upon his medium. So throughout the exhibition, things germinate, you see desiccation, there's a production of mold, there's rot, there's deterioration, there's degeneration, there's transmutation. At the same time, you see things sprouting like mushrooms. It is all intentionally uncontrolled. He has certain terms that he's begun to use to describe his art process, which I just think are charming. He calls this an encouragement structure, which is completely the opposite of art, which is going to be archivally produced to retain its condition the minute it leaves the artist's studio, no matter what the environmental cost of doing that. He also likes to use the term multiverse as opposed to universe, because his compositions are created not only out of a diversity of animals, but he works in the multiverse of sensual responses. The pieces are as olfactory and as tactile as they are visual. And he says, I just leave a tomato to rot and then watch from nearby what happens. It's really marvelous what happens inside it. There's nothing disgusting about it at all. It's just death meeting itself. Onward, here we go. Paul. When you see, he works in a lot of video and film work. What you see at first is usually from a distance. He has a pattern of working, and then you get closer and closer and closer to the details of what his subject is. And from a distance, they usually look very alive and luscious, and images are flowing very slowly, but it's very sumptuous and sensual. Then you get closer and closer and things start changing, and you see something like this, and you realize you are in a sewage treatment plant. And basically, do I have one more? Yeah. What you're looking at as it's being processed are strands of fecal matter that are being reconstituted. And he talks about abhorrence of bodily functions, and he talks about making them look visually enticing. So dark sun squeeze, he says, uses light, movement, and repetition to transform feces, a commodity with negative value, into something beautiful, processed for consumption. So these artists themselves are choosing that word to describe their works of art. Okay, now there is a reason why I do not have a slide of the last piece I'm going to show you, and that's because this work of art hasn't happened yet. But it's by Gregor Schneider, who's known to be an activist and tampering with taboos and social values, I think mostly for a very worthwhile cause. So Schneider is looking for someone who is terminally ill, who is willing to die in a gallery setting. Okay, so he says, "For years I have dreamed of a room in which people can die in peace. It's a simple room, flooded with light with a wooden floor. I have recreated this room, and at the moment it is standing right here in my studio." All right, and here we go. What does he say then? "My aim is to show the beauty of death." So he announced this opportunity in The Guardian, and they had a little essay with it, and he's waiting for his candidate to accept his invitation. He's not very concerned if there's no gallery that will allow him to conduct this artwork, because he said he'll simply find another place for it. But he's committed, and my prediction is he's going to fulfill it. Okay, so what do these last works of art have in common? What is beautiful about fecal matter, about decay, about putrefaction? Well, they all demonstrate that there is interconnectedness in ecosystems. They confirm the basic vital functioning of the world of life. There's no escaping this. We can never be true to our ecological position in the world if we are going to extract something from its normal context, because everything lives within a context, and we deceive ourselves into thinking it could ever be otherwise. We are embedded in our systems, and to ignore that is to ignore a basic truth of life on Earth. Anything that is not dynamic is opposed to the way ecosystems function. Anything that is not evolving, because organisms are continually adapting to conditions which are continually changing. That means everything, no matter what, is temporary, and to have a presumption that anything could survive and endure forever is also a false assumption. And just in terms of shapes, how alien it is to the actual physical world to think about simplifying shapes in terms of, for instance, geometric, primal kinds of forms, because every shape in the world is a response to conditions within that micro habitat, which means there are no two shapes that are alike in the world of ecology. And every shape is unique. And so to celebrate perpetual novelty may be another role for artists working with a new definition of beauty, and to demonstrate that when all is said and done in this crazy ecological world we're living in, maybe another presumption artists are going to have to abandon is the fact that they can predict their own outcome, because it's much too complicated for that. So essentially, maybe beauty is no longer quite so associated with what things look like, and the new ecological definition of beauty would be based on how things function. Thank you.
I don't hear it. to see how much we can scare ourselves or how much emotion we can provoke
Right.
with all this death and destruction, you know?
Well, I have something to say about that. Do you have an idea you want to offer about why it is that we relish gore in movies and abhor it in reality? Yeah?
I think a lot of it has to do with how numb we've become to some of the cruelties that go on, and we're trying to push ourselves so we can feel something again.
Yeah, I mean, that two-dimensional image is so far from actuality that we're able to have an emotional response to that that would never be transferable to real guts doing what they do in the dynamic ecological environment. And I think it's a testimony to the fact that we are living in an image-related world or image-dependent world. And frankly, my personal feeling is that is dangerous because it is abstract. It means we're responding purely visually. We have no responsibility to that thing that's occurring on the screen. It is purely titillating. And I think that it is alienating from all the functional integration that would make humans responsible for their environment. But it's a really good point because I think we're hyping up the kind of a gore that each decade and each year, and it seems like we become accustomed to a certain level of that kind of spewing of blood and eyeballs rolling and whatever else, and then they need to heighten it in order to keep us entertained.
This is going back to the beginning of your lecture about how you talked about how the blind people were asked what beauty is. I guess I would be interested in finding out what their interpretation of something that's ugly.
Oh, wouldn't that be interesting? I totally agree. A little background on Sophie Calla. She represents the component of our population that is so depleted and so dispirited that they can't seem to conduct their own lives, let alone be creative. And so this work of art was a demonstration of that because she, as an artist who's presumably an expert in beauty, could not yet make a statement or define what beauty might be. So she went to the most unlikely people who would know beauty, and those are people who have been blind since birth. So it's a very sad kind of document about a human condition. But that's beside the point. It still talked a lot just about beauty and what our cultural assumptions regarding beauty, I think, really are.
Hi, I have a personal appreciation for the complexity of like processes and like death and everything. But I want to I guess ask you have you ever have you seen artists or experiences? Because I also love architecture, and I'm wondering, how do you make buildings that are very stationary and very
Why do they have to be stationary?
Exactly. How do you make something like that
Porous.
and die and be recreated? So.
There is an artist who is growing architecture by taking cells and having them multiply on frames and having them gather up their resources for the building by absorbing the energy from the sun and the moisture and there are experiments taking place right now in which I think the whole premise of architecture as a static edifice that is presumably going to endure and that protects the inhabitants from the elements. What about welcoming the elements in and utilizing the elements? So there's, as you know, a lot of attention being paid to the sun that streams through the window in a house. Use it. It's energy. What can you do with your roof? There's rain falling on your roof, which you can use also as a resource. So I think the very conception of a building as a barricade between the inhabitants and the environment is beginning to erode. There's some experimental work being done with moving cities so that they're constantly being regenerated in the front from the materials that are dilapidated and decomposed in the back. And so the city begins to migrate to take advantage of the fact that it's inevitable the materials are going to decompose. So we just move them around to the front and the new structures happen there. I mean, the world is open for innovation. Go for it. You're the one who can do it, you know? Yeah.
I just actually want to continue there because I know your homestead and what you do, and I hope that you will expand this thesis outside of the visual arts, into sound and the environment, and installations that aren't necessarily even gallery-oriented, but definitely architecture and sound added to this would be
Thank you. I think it's a
absolutely
great suggestion. Yeah.
really important.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was just Gregor. Has anyone responded to his request? Is that
No,
not yet?
not yet. But Jory, do you know more about this than I do? No. So you know what is so distressing to me so often when some work of art like this becomes known to the public, then I constantly hear the public say, oh, here's another artist grandstanding, they'll do anything just to get attention to themselves, that they're only doing this because it's going to make headlines and it will, you know, they're showing off once again. And I mean, sometimes you have to just go so far beyond the norm in order to make a solid and serious statement. And ultimately, the works of art that get acknowledged as worthy, I think, are those that are rooted in a social and cultural, economic, ecological moment. And they function in that context. And the only time a work of art like this might be completely outrageous is when people cling to old definitions of what art should be. But if we just loosen up a little bit and let art go with the times, I think works of art like this will elicit thoughtful consideration instead of outrage and contempt, which it often does. Yeah.
I was just, in the earlier definitions of beauty, you talked about pleasure and control. And I don't know if you're familiar with Zayami's writings. He's a no theater. He actually was the codifier of no theater in Japan. And beauty is something they talk to great extents about. And in this treaty, he talks to all of his students, and he's basically saying to them, beauty is watching a court woman go insane. And it's, you know, and it suddenly you're just, it really challenges you to really try to figure that out. Mm-hmm. But there is a sense of beauty for things when they're unraveling, mm-hmm. when they're falling apart, when they're not quite as you think they should be. And it is because it's truth. The beauty is the truth. It's the truth of living. And something on the verge of dying is beautiful. That's another thing, actually. There's a group of Zen monks, and it's a great tradition that for Zen monks on their deathbed to compose their last haiku. And one of them, I remember, was the most poetic. I can't remember exactly, but it was to look into the deer's eyes on the brink of death, mm-hmm. and how beautiful that is. Mm-hmm. And for so many people, they might think that is so morbid, but there's something, if you can put yourself there, there's something quite amazing in that.
You might be interested in knowing another piece by Grimley. She is making a shroud for herself, she'll make them for others, and she is stitching into it these microcelia so that they're the particular kind of mushroom that thrives on the components of the human body as it decomposes. So she's thinking of her body ultimately as an offering to the environment as well. And I was thinking about that, and I said, well, gosh, that raises some really profoundly interesting questions, like what about testing your body for the toxins it's absorbed while you lived? Or what about people with a stainless steel hip or false teeth or breast implants and all these parts of the body that don't decompose? And should we have legislation giving certain people the right to be buried because their bodies will be beneficial to the ecosystem, and banish others from that process because they're going to mess things up? And just think of how complicated it is. Every component of being alive becomes invested with this kind of range of consideration. As soon as you stop thinking of yourself or of humans as being separate from the systems in which they're embedded.
Sitting here and like seeing you present this material kind of reminded me of when I was learning about romanticism in high school and how much I fell in love with it and how like macabre and how like revolutionary that was in itself. So that's when I kind of begun to think about how cyclical that was, like when I was reading the material, and how cyclical this is and how eye-opening it is and how eye-opening it was for the people in that generation. And so you mentioned earlier about like, you mentioned that beauty defines like the relationship between the individual and the environment. And I just wondered what other cultures would interpret our culture to be. For example, if we began to value things that they consider to be ugly, you know what I mean? So would that just start like a whole other revolution, like on their behalf? You know what I mean?
We are so connected globally, it's hard to think that anything is going to take place in terms of human reevaluation in isolation, although your example of an Asian tradition, which is much closer to a holistic, integrative value system than the kind that most of us have been brought up to believe in, might indicate that. I mean, it's interesting that that attitude did not filter through to the West, but we seem to have a prevailing monopoly on cultural attitudes pretty worldwide, but I have no idea. I would hope so, because I think that having a realistic acknowledgement of the human role in the broader arena could only be beneficial.
Hi. Okay, first it was very inspiring for me, the whole lecture, and there are so many things that were coming to my mind, but basically there like one point that for me was not clear, but it becomes kind of critical point, is that you begin the lecture quoting Sophie Kahle, and specifically she said, and it was the quotation, first class aesthetical experience. So it was the beauty inside the aesthetical discourse, let's say, basically. And then at the end we went through it, and then you start to expand the logic of the beauty through certain works that are implying, yes, the ecological approach, like larger systems, chain of relations, and then you start to push it further and further, and it's getting out of the realm of the aesthetical experience. But in the moment that it's getting out of the aesthetical experience, it's very hard to introduce a category of beauty than itself it's aesthetical. So it is somehow more questioning the idea of the sublime than itself the idea of the beauty, because when you put the beauty inside the category of the aesthetic and the aesthetic experience, as you mentioned before, then when there's something is becoming ungraspable as an aesthetical experience, then you have to face the conceptual problem of the redefinition of the idea of the sublime. So actually, when you start to think about the planet Earth like a huge ecosystem or a work of art that implies a transformative logic for various systems, you're losing the concept of the beauty, and you have to face a redefinition more about the concept of the sublime. And just it's not critical to the project. It's just like, I think it's very nice if I'm approaching this as a kind of catalog of with certain ethnographical approach of quotations and works, but in a conceptual level, it creates problems.
May I answer your question with two questions? In terms of the sublime, when you respond to something outside of yourself with that intensity of awe and wonder, you really isolate yourself from that thing that you are honoring. And I think, do you think, it could be as different from an ecological definition as is possible. You stand in worship the sun without imagining that the sun is the source of energy that fuels our entire planet. And when something is in the category of the sublime, then you fear and you tremble in front of it, and you feel that you could never interact with it. It is just too grandiose to ever incorporate a human component. So I think it's really quite separating. But the other thing you're suggesting is something that I agonize over, because I write. I need words. And when you take a word like beauty, which is so loaded with assumptions, and you're presenting it in a new way, do you think we should try to find a brand new word for it and just abandon that old word and get on with it? Or, I ask myself, I ask you, is it more important to hammer away at a redefinition to demonstrate the extent of the reformation, the reconsideration, the revolution, whatever you want to call it, that we're undergoing as soon as we really start acting in an environmental manner? So there is the obstruction, people's assumption. You have to undo that. That's complicated and cumbersome. It takes a lot of time. It's a nagging kind of thing. But if you don't do that, you're making it too easy to make the shift. And I think understanding the huge leap we're confronting right now may also be very valuable. So I open it to you. You think we're just inventing a new word would streamline this whole issue?
It's a little bit like asking, it's almost like art and beauty, superimposing the two. You're superimposing the definition of art, basically.
Well, anybody who's always assumed that the function of art is to create a beautiful image, yes, that's totally true. Mm-hmm. So thank you all for listening. Yeah. Oh, there's one more. No? I think there's one. Would you want to or no?
If I may add a note, in Bali, when the person dies, we made big ceremony, public ceremony. But then after, 2 days later, it's a very small, tiny familiar ceremony honoring nature, thanking for borrow their parts, for that person being alive, with the fact that that person was alive. Beautiful ceremony, very small, tiny.
It's wonderful. You're reminding me. I happened to have been in New Orleans when Professor Longhair died some years ago, and I went to Professor Longhair's funeral, and I had never been. Have you been to, or do you know about New Orleans? You are, yay. Oh my gosh, it was one of the most memorable experiences of my life. But there is a slow dirge-like parade to the cemetery with the body being carried, and everybody is walking along and demonstrating their sorrow, seeming very mournful. The instant the body is placed in the ground, the bands strike up. Everybody has an umbrella. They open up the umbrellas. They're drinking, they're partying, they're dancing, they're celebrating. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.